Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Ujima for having organized this event on behalf of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, the organization which will be receiving the honorarium, which I will be presented with after this event. I thought I might preface my remarks by talking a little bit about my own personal history. This is indeed Black History Month. And all too often in this country, our history becomes buried and we're no longer able 10, 15, 20 years after events have transpired to grasp the importance of those events. And recently, in many of the lectures I have given on college campus, I have spent a few moments at the beginning talking a little bit about my own personal history. There was a time when my name was in the newspapers and I was on television and all of those kinds of things, and of course it had to do with the trial, which I'll talk about presently. But of course now years have gone by. It's been 13 years or so since I was arrested. In 1972 I was acquitted. I was found not guilty. And many of you, I imagine, were quite young 13 years ago. Some of you, at least. Yeah. Well, not very long ago in one of my classes, the students, the beginning of each semester, I generally ask the students to say something about themselves and why they are taking a particular course. And of course, some of the students generally say that they want to take a course because they want to take that particular course because I'm teaching it, and they wanted to make sure they took a course with me before they graduated. And there was this one student who, towards the end of these discussions, finally looked at me and said, "Just who are you?" And so I said, "Well, I imagine that a number of the students in the class know who I am because I spent some time in jail." You spent some time in jail? Well, in any event, in 1969, as a matter of fact, I had been accepted as a member of the faculty at UCLA, the philosophy department. And before I had the opportunity to teach my first class, I learned that I had been fired by the Board of Regents, on which the governor sat as an ex officio member, the governor at that time, of course, being Ronald Reagan. I was fired from my position at UCLA because I was a member of the Communist Party. At that time, I pointed out that it was because I was a communist, but it was also because I was black, and it was also because I was a woman. And during the year 1969, 1970, I did teach as a result of receiving an injunction prohibiting the regents from firing me pending the outcome of the case in the higher courts. But at the same time, I recognized that it was important not only for me to defend my right to teach, but it was also important to draw the connections between what was happening on the campus and what was happening in the community, what was happening in the streets and what was happening in the jails and the prisons. At that particular time, of course, the Black Panther Party all over the country was under attack. J. Edgar Hoover, who headed the FBI at that time, had conspired with numerous chiefs of police in major cities across the country literally to destroy the Black Panther Party. And so there were violent assaults on their offices. Right here in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles SWAT team, the National Guard attacked the Black Panther Party office because, as they put it, they had a warrant for a person whom they believed to be a member of the Black Panther Party, and this person had been charged with disturbing the peace. Well, they went with helicopters and dynamite and tear gas and machine guns and everything imaginable. And the SWAT squad, those men were involved in their first active assault in this country, most of them having gotten their experience in Vietnam as Green Berets. That is what that period was like. And so it became very important to me to link up what was happening to me, the political repression which I was suffering, with what was happening in the larger community. There was a case involving George Jackson, John Cloutier, Fleeta Drumgo, who had been charged in Soledad, at Soledad prison, with having killed a guard. They had been fraudulently charged with murder. And had they been convicted, they would have been sentenced to death. I felt that it was extremely important to, again, establish the connection between the repression of which I was a victim on the campus and the repression which the Soledad brothers were suffering in prison. Of course, I only risk the possibility of losing my job. They risked the possibility of losing their lives. At the same time, at UCLA, if any of you remember that era, you will recall that it was extremely violent. I personally received numerous threats there, day after day, week after week. As a matter of fact, the campus security generally accompanied me to start my car. And one of the police officers would get into the car and start, and the other would stand behind a cement pillar, which I learned to do as well. There would be days when I would be delivering a lecture, and one of the campus cops would enter the lecture hall and would call me aside and say that they had just learned that threats on my life had been made, perhaps on the campus, perhaps at other parts of Los Angeles, and that they were going to accompany me until I left the campus. Well, they provided very good security for me while I was on the campus. They wanted to make sure that I didn't get killed on UCLA's campus, you see. But I had to arrange for my own security once I stepped off of the campus. And therefore I did purchase a number of weapons, which were used by various individuals who did security for me during that period. Well, of course, several of those weapons were later used by Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson's brother. Jonathan was very much involved in the struggle to free his brother and the two other Soledad brothers. He was very young. He was 16 years old when he became involved in that movement. He had hoped to see his brother free for some 10 years, since he had been 6 years old or so, and had never seen him since the age of 6 outside of prison walls. Had never seen him when he wasn't chained or watched over by an armed guard. Of course, on August 7th, 1970, there was what has come to be called the Marin County Prisoner rebellion. Jonathan was killed. Other prisoners were killed. And because weapons that were registered in my name were used, I was charged with murder, kidnap, and conspiracy. I went underground, eventually was arrested, eventually stood trial. In the meantime, a vast movement developed. As a result of that movement, finally, in the summer of 1972, I was acquitted. It was at that time that we established an organization which we felt was extremely needed at that time, because although the victory of my acquittal was important, there were many, many other political prisoners. There were many, many other manifestations of racist and political repression. Therefore, we established the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And this is the organization I'm representing today. This is a very difficult period. If we talk about the past, if we talk about the past decade, if we talk about the past century, if we talk about the past 2 centuries, it seems to me that what we ought to seek in discussing black history are lessons on how to struggle today. This is a very difficult period. We've seen the erosion of victories that have been won over the years by people struggling against racism, against economic injustices, against male supremacy. The impact of the Reagan administration has been devastating. It has been devastating for working people. It has been devastating for women. It has been devastating for black people and Chicanos and Puerto Ricans and Native American Indians and Asians. It has been devastating for youth. It has been devastating for the disabled. It has been devastating for gays and lesbians. It has been devastating for virtually every oppressed group in this society. And I think that if we have any immediate goal, if there is an urgent goal which we all ought to seek to achieve during this period, that is the defeat of Ronald Reagan and his administration. Now, as you've heard, this is Black History Month. It seems to me that the time ought to eventually come when we don't have to set aside 1 month to talk about black history. But this is a time, indeed, when we should reflect on the struggles and the contributions of Afro-Americans, not simply for the sake of acquiring knowledge about black people, although this is extremely important because given the racism in our educational system, most people in this country do not have the opportunity to learn about the contributions and the struggles of black people. But we should also take some time to reflect on those contributions and those struggles, because this information can assist us in our battles today. And it is not only important for black people and other people of color to understand and to grasp the meaning of the historical struggles waged by black people. It is important for white people as well. As a matter of fact, I think that if you examine the history of black people in this country, you will see that each time black people have won victories, this has meant the extension of rights and liberties for the vast majority of the population of this country. This has meant the extension of democratic rights and liberties for the masses of white people as well. And I say this because we're oftentimes misled by this notion that when black people benefit, that means that white people are going to have to suffer. This mythological pie that we always hear about, and there are only so many slices in it. So if black people get a bigger slice of the pie, that means that that must come from the slice that white people were already enjoying. But of course, in actuality, each time black people win a victory, the whole pie is enlarged. And we should understand that, because the efforts to successful, unfortunately, to a certain extent, to convince the majority of people in this country that affirmative action does not benefit the masses of people. It benefits only black people, or only racially oppressed people, or indeed only women as opposed to men. But that's not the case. That is not the case. And I think we all have to develop the kinds of arguments that are persuasive so that we are able to convince others that the fight against racism is a fight that all progressive people in this country should be waging, regardless of what their racial background might be. I want to talk a little bit about racism in education. But before I speak about some of the contemporary manifestations of racism, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the struggle for knowledge among black people. And this is something that historically has been very sacred. As a matter of fact, in many ways, the struggle for Afro-American liberation has been synonymous with the struggle for knowledge, with the struggle for education. When you consider that slaves were prohibited from learning how to read and write, and were often, as a matter of fact, executed if it were found out that they had learned how to read the Bible or had learned how to write. And of course, writing was very important for slaves, because if you knew how to write, you could write out your own pass. And of course, no slave had the right to be off a plantation or off the farm unless he or she possessed a permit written out by the master. And since it was assumed that the slaves could not read or write, if a black person who was obviously a slave held a piece of paper saying that they had the right to be off the plantation at that particular time, that might serve, of course, as a means of following the Underground Railroad to freedom. Black people sacrificed a great deal to be able to learn how to read and write. As a matter of fact, there were often night schools run by black women. And if you know what the workday was like for slaves from sun up to sundown, or from can't see in the morning to can't see no more at night, especially during the cotton harvest. And when you consider that many people, after they had put in this hard day's work, would return to the quarters, and after the master and his family had gone to sleep, would get up and spend several hours studying. There were midnight schools. And can you imagine going to sleep at 2 or 3 in the morning and then waking up again at 5 to go out into the fields? And I mention this because all too often the kinds of justifications that have been given for the lack of facilities, for the lack of educational facilities for black people have rested on the notion that black people really don't want to get an education anyway. Or else if we want to, we are not capable of being educated, as a William Shockley or an Arthur Jensen might say. That even if we are exposed, we are not genetically capable of learning what white people are genetically capable of learning. Now, Frederick Douglass disputed that notion, if anyone ever disputed it. Frederick Douglass was in the process of learning how to read when he was quite young. His master's wife began to teach him how to read as she taught her own son. She was from the North, however, and had not really been schooled in the ways of the slavocracy. And when her husband caught her teaching Frederick Douglass how to read and write, he admonished her severely and said, for example, if you give a black person, he didn't say black person, he used a derogatory term in use for a black person. He said, if you give a black person an inch, he'll take an L. And he said, and besides, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. And Frederick Douglass heard that statement, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. And as he said in his autobiography, he knew exactly what he had to begin to do in order to make his way in the direction of liberation. He began to learn how to read and write by hook and by crook. If it meant that he would have to play tricks with the little white boys in order to convince them to show him what this word meant or how to spell that word, he did that. And he not only managed to learn how to read and write, but he developed into one of this country's greatest writers, and certainly one of its most outstanding orators and most effective abolitionists. Of course, in the aftermath of slavery, black people demanded the right to an education, finally. If emancipation meant anything, and of course, emancipation really wasn't about freedom at all. And we all know that Abraham Lincoln didn't really want to free the slaves, don't we? Don't we? He is the great liberator, of course, and his statue sits in Washington, high up. But of course, Abraham Lincoln pointed out that himself on several occasions that if it were possible to save the Union without freeing the slaves, he would do that. And as a matter of fact, Karl Marx had written Abraham Lincoln numerous times from the beginning of the outbreak of the Civil War and had encouraged him to abolish slavery, pointing out that this really was the only way to ensure a Union victory. Abraham Lincoln did not listen at first, and it was only later when it became clear that a Union victory was absolutely contingent on black people fighting. Because if black people fought, they were fighting for their freedom. And black men and women alike fought in the Union Army. You may know that Harriet Tubman became and remains the only woman in the history of this country ever to have led troops in battle. And even after that, they refused to give her a pension. She fought for years and years to get a soldier's pension. Finally, she received it. But of course, when the Emancipation Proclamation was pronounced, and the masses of slaves were allowed to leave the plantations, one of the very first things they did, even before the war had come to an end, was to appeal to Washington, appeal to Congress to send teachers so that they could begin to learn how to read and write. And finally, of course, when the Freedmen's Bureau was set up, the most outstanding contributions of the Freedmen's Bureau was the creation of schools, of public schools. And many of the teachers who went down from the North were absolutely astounded by what they saw, by the tenacity with which black people set out to acquire knowledge, by their perseverance. And they've described 70, 80-year-old black people spending hours trying to decipher a few words in Webster's speller, or spending hours trying to learn how to write their names. And it was said by many of the teachers that in the areas where they were teaching, although the housing that the former slaves lived in often did not involve even having a wooden floor. Often the floor was dirt, there were no beds, no chairs, no furniture at all. But it was said that if you found nothing else in one of these shacks, you would always find a book. You would find Webster's speller, or you would find the Bible. And that whole effort to begin to establish a system which would allow black people finally to gain some knowledge was described by W.E.B. Du Bois as one of the most marvelous occurrences in the history of humankind. And what is important about that is not only that black people finally acquired the right to gain some knowledge, but that in the process, the masses of white people in the South acquired that right as well. Because you see, before the Civil War, during slavery times, only the wealthy were able to go to school. Only the sons and daughters of the slaveholders, only those who could afford to pay for it. Finally, when the public school system was set up as a result of the demand that black people made for education, poor white people also were finally able to send their children to school. And I give you this as one example of the extent to which white people in this country have benefited from the gains that Afro-Americans have achieved. Now, of course, those victories which came during the period of radical Reconstruction did not last very long. And that period is really fascinating because some of the most progressive legislation was passed during that era, not only for black people, but for women, divorce laws, for example, not only laws against racism, but laws against anti-Semitism as well. Check out your history. Of course, you have to go a little bit further than the text you usually get in high school or college, because in those texts, they usually say something about the carpetbaggers and the scalawags, and then they leave it at that, right? And you're left with this impression that during the 1870s, you had a bunch of inept black politicians who didn't know what they were doing, And, finally, if you went to school in the South like I did, you were informed that finally forces such as the Ku Klux Klan were able to reestablish the rule of civilization in the South. And when I went to school in Birmingham, Alabama, I went to segregated schools. The legacy of that period following Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, when Jim Crow was established as an institution, when black people were disfranchised, when lynchings began to occur at an incredible rate, thousands and thousands of lynchings during that period. I went to school in Birmingham, Alabama. I went to elementary school in a little shack. There were a few little shacks around, and they all had wood stoves, coal stoves, pot-bellied stoves, unpainted floors. We had virtually no facilities. We had no recreational facilities at all. We had a place that we called the bowl to play in, which was a sort of a hollowed out area with red clay, and we had books that had been cast away by the white students, the books that contained the same racist ideology. And if I had believed my history books, I would have looked at the Civil War as the war for Southern independence, and would have believed that when slavery was abolished, this was the worst thing that black people had expected or wanted. Because as my textbook said, now these 4 million black people would have to worry about a job, and they would have to worry about finding some place to stay, and all of the other things that they didn't have to worry about at all as long as they were slaves. Yeah, this is what my textbook said. What was ironic about that school was that we, the black kids, could stand on the hill and look over to the next hill where the white kids' elementary school was located. And of course it was a beautiful brick building, and they had all kinds of swings and sliding boards and all of those kinds of things which we could see. But of course not so for the black school system. And of course that fight, the fight against racism in education, as it took shape during the latter part of the 1800s, as a part of the larger edifice of racism. And let us remember that racism as we know it today was not so much the product of what the slaveholders did, although of course slavery was what established racism in the first place. But racism as we know it today is largely a product of the rise of monopoly capitalism. Because it was not until the monopoly era of capitalism began to emerge, and not until they moved into the South. I mean, this is the period, of course, when the Rockefellers made their money, the Morgans, the Carnegies, all of the major capitalist families made their millions during that period. And they did it by expanding all over the country, including into the South, and at the same time, they were expanding to other parts of the world as well. Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, etc. And I mention this because I think that oftentimes we just assume that racism came from the South. And if it hadn't been for the perverse slaveholders, as horrible as they were, racism wouldn't exist today. Well, the capitalists took advantage of this system of racism which had been established and used it in order to turn white people against black people, poor white people, white working people. And they needed to do this in order to be able to establish the kind of working class in the South that would not be able to fight in a united manner. They needed the white workers to believe that black people were their enemies, and that, as a matter of fact, they had more in common with their white employers who were oppressing them than they did with their black co-workers. And I always say that must have been a hell of a thing to have been able to convince white people that somehow or another, just because their skin was white, that they were superior. And when you think about it, it really sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? I mean, if you're being worked to death, just like a black person next to you is being worked to death, but somehow or another you're white and you have straight hair or whatever, it doesn't matter as much. Or just because the man who's working you to death is white, you have more in common with him than you do with your black sister or brother. Well, that was a hell of a process. It didn't just happen because white people had stood together with black people during radical Reconstruction. And as a matter of fact, even during slavery, white people had suffered. Poor white people. Poor white people had been pushed up into the hills, into the mountains by the slaveholders who expanded their plantations when cotton became king. You know, the hillbillies today, they're up in the hills because their land was taken by the cotton planters, and they were pushed upwards. But all of this had to be reversed, and it was reversed during that period. And when you consider what it required in order to convince the masses of white people in the South, and not just in the South, incidentally, all over the country as well, but the focus was in the South. The lynchings that took place, the thousands and thousands of lynchings, the picnics that were associated with the lynchings, white parents bringing their little children to see a black person being burned at stake. Oh yes, this is what happened during that period. So that it would take decades and decades and decades to undo that damage. The damage has still not been undone. The damage has still not been undone. And when we talk about racism today, we have to recognize what the potential of racism is. And the potential of racism is lynching. The potential is that violence that has already occurred in the history of this country. When we talk about education today, there are about 1 million black students enrolled in institutions of higher learning. Over 50% of all black people who are attending institutions of higher learning are in the 2-year colleges. And those are the institutions which are the colleges with the least resources, we all know. Of course, during the period of the late 60s, from the middle 60s to the late 60s, there was a tremendous movement that spread all over the country on all of the college campuses, demanding that more students of color be accepted. I went to college at Brandeis University in Boston, right outside of Boston. There were about 5 black students out of about 1,500 at Brandeis. That was a real shock to me. And while I was in college, I do not remember a single course which I took in which I learned about the achievements of Afro-Americans. I remember the literature courses that I took, and I don't remember a single course utilizing a black novel or black poetry. And I never heard of the name of Francis E.W. Harper or Zora Neale Hurston. And of course, finally, as a result of the movement, the civil rights movement, which got started at the end of the 50s, 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott, that moved into the 60s. Students during the 60s, students of all colors went down to the South and participated in 1964 in the massive voter registration campaign that eventually led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But in the meantime, students had been exposed to activism. As a matter of fact, on every college now, on every college campus, there's supposed to be a free speech area, right? I guess you have one here. Yeah? Well, there's supposed to be a free speech area outside on every college campus because in 1964, when some students attempted to recruit other students on the campus at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, to go down to register black people to vote in the South, they were kicked off the campus. They were not allowed to distribute their literature and to talk about what they were doing on the campus. Well, students fought for the right to go on campus and recruit students to go down south. They formed a free speech movement. The free speech movement spread throughout. Finally, the right to free speech was acquired. That, again, is another example of how the struggle for black liberation has benefited everyone. And of course, many of us don't know this. These aren't things that are recorded in the Orthodox histories, are they? And we're extremely handicapped if we aren't familiar with these dynamics. Well, of course, eventually there were demands in the late 60s for Afro-American studies departments and for more black students, Chicano students, Native American Indian students. As a matter of fact, I can remember in 1967, 1968, when I was a graduate student at the University of California, San Diego, we decided that we would fight for a college. The university consists of numerous colleges. At that time there were 2, and they were about to establish the 3rd college. We demanded that the 3rd college be called Lumumba Zapata College, after Patrice Lumumba and Emiliano Zapata. And we also demanded that that college accept 1/3 black students, 1/3 Chicano students, and 1/3 white students from working class backgrounds. And we had to disrupt the academic senate a couple of times. And finally we got some faculty members to go along with us. We had to break into the registrar's office, and we occupied the registrar's office. We had to make some sacrifices. But finally, we won that demand. And now if there is a substantial number of black students and Chicano students on the campus at UCSD, it is thanks to Lumumba Zapata College. But of course, they didn't like the name. It is called Third College. But whenever I go down that way, I remind the students that it's up to them to continue to call it Lumumba Zapata. And it's interesting. It's good that the history somehow or another gets passed down. I know the last time I went down, some of the students said, "Oh, this is the college that you founded, isn't it?" I said, "No, I didn't found this college. I struggled for this college with a lot of other students on this campus, and almost got kicked out of school as a result of it, as a matter of fact." And of course, during that period, there was the fight for Afro-American studies. At San Francisco State University, where I teach now, there was a vast strike in 1968. A student, faculty, and worker strike which shut the whole damn university down. And the major demand of that strike was a Black Studies department. And that demand expanded into a Third World Studies department. Eventually it came to be called the School of Ethnic Studies. Now we have the School of Ethnic Studies, which is the only school in the entire country, a school that brings together Black studies and Asian American studies and La Raza studies and American Indian studies. But a couple of years ago, the administration tried to say that S.I. Hayakawa, who was brought in to put down the strike as president, did not sign the papers. You know, in negotiating, he agreed that the School of Ethnic Studies would be established, but he never signed the legal papers. So that legally, we did not constitute a school. Well, as you see, the struggle still goes on. Well, in 1973, there were about 600 Afro-American studies departments and programs and other institutions. There are presently about 325. About 50% of those 325 are full-fledged degree granting departments. And the other 50% include programs that offer as few as 2 Black Studies courses. Is there a Black Studies department in Occidental? Is there? Nobody knows? Nobody knows, there must not be one. Well, this is a struggle that must continue. You see, as soon as it appeared that the kinds of struggles that were waged in the late 60s were not going to happen with the same intensity, then they began to eliminate, dismantle many of the programs. And I should point out that not only Afro-American studies programs, but also Latino studies programs, also Asian American programs, and also women's studies programs, because women's studies came into being as a result of these struggles that were waged for Afro-American studies. And presently there are, as I said, very few. Now this is a shame, because where are we going to get this information from? We don't get it on television. We don't get it, unfortunately, in most elementary schools. And it's not going to be taught in the elementary schools and the high schools until it's taught as a requirement in the institutions of higher learning. The teachers have to be taught. Most teachers don't know anything about Afro-American studies. I mean, most teachers don't even know about the contributions of black people in their own field. You know, I teach a course in photography, a course in the history of photography. It's called Photography and Social Conscience. And I have students who've been studying photography for a long time, who've been studying the history of photography and don't know the name of one single black photographer. Don't even know the name of James Van der Zee or Gordon Parks, because their teacher never mentioned it to them. And I guess their teacher doesn't know, because I've been checking out the authoritative histories of photography, and black photographers aren't even mentioned in the histories, in the authoritative histories. And then in the meantime, Afro-American studies programs are often seen as consisting of, quote, Mickey Mouse courses. And unfortunately, there are students who often come into ethnic studies programs thinking that that's the easiest way they can get an A. And that's a shame. Because, and this is what I always tell my students, the first day, you know, I always make it very clear that they're all welcome, but they're going to have to work. And perhaps work harder than they would have to work in their other courses, because they have to compensate for a great deal of information they have not acquired, a great deal of information that has been kept hidden from them. So they're going to have to do some extra work. And I always point out that if there's anything that's really important to them, it ought to be those courses. Courses that deal with the groups of people in this society who have been historically eliminated from the historical accounts. But of course, black studies is viewed with suspicion. It's seen oftentimes as political as opposed to educational. It's assumed that only black students are going to be interested in black studies. But black students have to learn about white people. As a matter of fact, for a long time, that's all we were learning in our schools. And it's a trip that somehow, you know, we have to be compelled to learn about all the contributions that white people have made to the history of this country, but white people do not have to learn about the contributions that black people have made. Somehow or another, this is seen as being interesting only for black people. That's a trip, isn't it? But many white students fall for this. And they want to go enroll in a black studies course. There's some who do, yes. There's some who do. It's very interesting. I teach in ethnic studies. I teach in women's studies. And I've taught courses in black studies. The courses in women's studies are generally predominantly white. Even courses dealing with black women, because I teach a course called The History of Afro-American Women. The courses in black studies are almost all black. And I think this has to change. And we all have to acknowledge that these courses are very precious courses. And they may not be around very long if we don't defend and protect them. And I always tell my students, I said, hey, you open up this class schedule and you see English, 572, and you see this course and you see that course, and then you get to ethnic studies 560, and they all look the same. But you have to remember that these courses, these ethnic studies courses, these women's studies courses, were achieved as a result of sacrifices. People were beaten, people went to jail, people were kicked out of school, people lost their jobs in order to guarantee that one day you might have the opportunity to take such a course as this. And I think that if on this campus you do not have an Afro-American Studies department, I think that you could do well to talk about establishing one. Now let's look for a moment at graduate and professional enrollment. Well, we all know about the Bakke case, don't we? Again, poor Mr. Bakke. Poor Mr. Bakke was led to believe that all he had to do is attack black people or Asians, Pacific Islanders, Chicanos, and this was the way to guarantee that he and people to whom he feels close could become doctors. Well, we have one of the worst healthcare systems of all of the capitalist countries, not to speak of the socialist countries. One of the worst. There are not nearly enough doctors to satisfy the actual need. There are not nearly enough black doctors. I think black doctors are just a little more than 2%. But there are not enough white doctors either. And so the solution is not to go and try to attack black people or racially oppressed people. The solution would have been to demand open admissions, to struggle together with black people and other people of color and demand the right of anyone in this country who wants to study medicine to study it. Not only to be able to study it, but to be able to study it free of all charge. I mean, these are the kinds of demands that should be made. But of course, poor Mr. Bakke was misled by racist ideology. And if we look at the medical school enrollment of black students, we see a really discouraging trend. Well, first of all, in 1969, as the movement was beginning to grow and develop, there were 1,042 black medical students, which was about 2.8% of the medical school population. In 1974, as a result of the struggles of the late 60s and early 70s, that number rose to about 3,555. That number then declined after 1974. Not only did the decline occur among the medical school population, but also among the law school black population. And as a matter of fact, after 1974, you had a decline in all master's and doctoral programs as far as the number of black participants in those programs were concerned. You see, what happened was that in the Bakke case, the court decided that race and ethnicity may be used in determining admissions to academic programs, but that the institution would be able to decide whether to use race or how much value to place on it. And it is very clear from the statistics that there has not been any kind of positive discretion used in order to guarantee that the numbers of black medical law school students remains either constant or rises. We have some tremendous problems in education today. Not only are there smaller numbers of students proportionately, but if you consider the black faculty in institutions of higher learning, only 4.3% of the total higher educational faculty is black. Only 4.3%. Well, of course, there are those who say that, well, suppose we do establish an affirmative action program. Where are we going to get the black students from? You know, they always say that. Where are they going to come from? And then they point to the fact that the schools in the black community are not the kinds of schools that would prepare students to attend an institution such as this. And they might be right. Yes, they might be right. But just because the high schools and the elementary schools are in such bad shape, does that give these institutions the right to penalize students who've necessarily been forced to attend those schools? You know, I remember when I went to elementary school and high school in Birmingham, there were a hell of a lot of things that I did not know. Finally, when I went to New York to spend my last 2 years of high school there, I had never really written a paper. You know? I was going to this private school where, you know, students in the 11th grade were studying Marx and Freud. We had, for example, I learned when I was, after I arrived in New York, that in order to graduate from that high school, you had to have 4 years of French. And I had never even heard of French. I mean, I had never heard anybody speak a foreign language, much less having read it or attempted to say something, you know, in French myself. Well, eventually I majored in French literature, and, you know, I spent time studying in Paris and so forth. But if anybody had told me then, you know, that one day I would be doing that, I wouldn't have believed them. But I worked hard. And I was able to catch up with those students, many of whom were very wealthy, had had the very best education, you know, all of whom, except one other student in my class, were white. I needed a little help, yes. I had to have French tutoring, yes. But I was able to catch up. We can catch up. It's not that hard. And as a matter of fact, it's the responsibility of institutions of higher learning to establish the kinds of programs that will be able to compensate for the fact that many students have not been given an equal opportunity to learn. Sometimes it may mean going into the high schools. Sometimes it may mean starting a program in the high school itself. And of course, that's good because you can have college students who need jobs and who need financial aid, and that's something important that they could do. But of course, you know, many of the universities never think about this. As a matter of fact, there are universities, and I could, if I were able to speak longer, I'd be able to give you more detail on this, but there are universities often that have affirmative action programs and accept people of color knowing that they're going to fail and program them to fail so that they can say that they accepted students of color and it didn't work out because they weren't intelligent enough. Well, I think that particularly during this period, it is important for us to reflect upon the way in which we can transform the situation that prevails on the college campuses. And I think that it's important to see this within the context of a larger struggle. Because if we're concerned about what's happening on the college campuses, we should also be concerned about what's happening to working people. And again, I know that that many of you may or may not be workers, but you're going to have to start looking for a job after you get out of school. And you're going to find, unless some drastic changes occur, that you may be standing in the same unemployment line with an automobile worker. And that's why it's important to recognize that we all have to stand together and to get rid of the elitism that is encouraged by these institutions that oftentimes cause you to look upon your sisters and brothers who are workers as being less than you are, as being inferior to you. And I think it's important for students to get involved in the fight for jobs and to get involved in the fight for unemployment compensation. As a matter of fact, you know, one of the problems that young black people, many young black people are confronting today, and in some parts of the country, in some cities, the vast majority of the youth, the black youth, not only are they not able to find a job now, but they have no hope of finding a job anytime in the near future, because they have come to become part of a permanent unemployed labor force. And the problem, of course, is that if you never had a job, you can't get unemployment. As a matter of fact, if you never had a job, you're not even counted, really. And so one of the demands I think we have to talk about making is unemployment compensation from the very first moment you begin to look for a job. If they can't provide a job for you, then they have to give you some unemployment compensation. You just watch how quick the jobs will begin to appear. And where will the jobs come from? Well, you heard Mr. Reagan not too long ago when he announced his proposed budget for 1985, $926 billion. That's a hell of a lot of money, isn't it? Where do you think that money comes from? It's money that we pay. It just doesn't spontaneously materialize. It's money that comes, as a matter of fact, the vast majority of that comes from working people, because the wealthiest people don't even pay taxes. They have all the loopholes, you know, and all the tax breaks that Reagan was talking about. They all went to the wealthiest. So he increased the Pentagon budget by $46.8 billion. $305 billion actually going into the Pentagon, and another $8 billion for nuclear weapons that are carried in the energy budget. And what are the proposed cutbacks? $900 million from rural housing for the poor and moderate income. $166 million from Section 202, which is housing for the elderly. 25% of that program has been slashed, would be slashed if Reagan has his way. $652 million from AFDC. That means that the recipients would be forced to work for benefits. And when you consider how many women are forced to go on AFDC because they can't get a job that will provide them enough income to pay for child care, and now they're being told that they have to perform slave labor for the pittance that they receive under AFDC. Well, college students. $600 million is being proposed as a cut from the aid to low-income college students. So some of you who may have funding here should understand that you have a lot to lose. $1.1 billion cut in Medicare $5.7 billion proposed cuts in Medicaid over the next 5 years, 5% cut in urban mass transit, $300 million cut in jobs training. Well, there's something wrong with an administration that sees the priorities as being the construction of Trident nuclear submarines, Pershing IIs, cruise missiles, MX missiles, all of which is doing nothing but bringing us closer and closer to the edge of nuclear death, global nuclear death. And of course, how is Reagan able to do this? He's created this myth of the Soviet menace. This myth of the Soviet menace. Because you see, most people in this country would agree that it is ridiculous to have all of these billions of dollars going into the creation of all of these horrible weapons, and at the same time creating the kind of situation where people are going to starve, where people are going to die, where people are going to be homeless, where people aren't going to be able to find jobs. Most people would agree with that. But then you see, they think that the Russians are going to get us. And we have to do everything possible to prevent the Russians from getting us. The boogeyman. That is their whole anti-communist strategy. And you see, most people don't realize that there's parity right now between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. There's no superior. The Soviet Union is not superior. Most people don't realize that in the whole history of the arms race, the Soviet Union has never taken a step forward before the U.S. has. The Soviet Union has never taken the first step. From the time the first atom bomb was invented and exploded on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the creation of the MX missile and the deployment of the Pershing II and cruise missiles in Europe. But there are those forces who have a great deal to gain from those billions of dollars going into the Pentagon budget. There's a vast military-industrial complex. They are the ones behind Reagan. See, Reagan, we can't give him all the credit. He's, as a matter of fact, basically a figurehead. He's really not capable of being very much more than a figurehead, you know. But he's precisely the kind of figurehead that the military-industrial complex needs, because they are pushing an insane list of priorities, literally insane. And they need someone who corresponds to that insanity to be out there representing that policy.